"Kiss me once before the ceremony," the Alpha King whispered, and the Omega took his breath away. "Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Ethan Blackwood stood beneath the high arches of Moonfall Citadel, where pale stone caught the glow of 1,000 candles and reflected it like steady breath held in place, the kind of quiet that presses against the chest and makes even a king aware of his pulse. And for the first time in years he felt the weight of a ceremony, not as power, but as expectation, every banner aligned, every attendant in position, every note rehearsed to perfection. Yet something was missing, something he could not name, a soft imbalance in the air that tugged at him the way a distant tide pulls at the shore without sound. And as he turned slightly, the faint echo of boots against marble reminded him how closely the court watched, how carefully they counted his steps, how eagerly they waited to see which name he would choose. Because tonight was not merely a formality but a promise to the realm, a moment that would be remembered and repeated in halls and hearths for generations. Across the great chamber, nearly lost among orderly rows and polished fabrics, stood Clara Hale, an Omega invited without ceremony and dressed without ornament, her presence quiet enough to pass unseen, yet steady enough to hold its own, her hands folded, her posture composed, her gaze lifted not in challenge but in calm attention, and though no herald announced her and no whispers followed her name, she felt the gravity of the place settle around her shoulders like a borrowed cloak, reminding her that destiny does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it simply waits. Ethan felt it then, the subtle shift that made his breath slow and his thoughts narrow, not a command from his wolf and not the pull of spectacle, but a recognition shaped by stillness. And as the hall filled with murmurs that rolled like distant thunder, his eyes found her again, not because she demanded notice but because she did not, because she stood unafraid of being overlooked. And in that quiet courage he sensed the answer he had not known he was seeking. The bells had not yet rung, the vows had not yet been spoken, and the world seemed to pause in that suspended second before history moves. And Ethan, Alpha King of a united realm, realized that the ceremony mattered less than the truth rising in his chest, that the breath he held was not for the court, but for the moment that would change everything. And as the candles flickered and the air warmed with anticipation, fate drew a careful line between them, waiting for the smallest step to bring it into light. Clara Hale had learned long ago how to occupy space without claiming it, how to stand still enough that attention flowed around her like water around stone, and in Moonfall Citadel that skill served her well as attendants moved past with measured steps, adjusting candles, whispering confirmations, never once meeting her eyes, and she told herself that this was expected, that Omegas like her were invited to complete the symmetry of the hall, not to alter its outcome. The marble beneath her slippers felt cool, the temperature steady and calm, and she counted her breaths the way she always did when rooms grew too large and voices blended into a single low hum, inhaling slowly, exhaling slower, keeping her thoughts close and quiet. She knew the stories people told about the Alpha King, about his precision and restraint, about the way he weighed decisions as if they were measured in pounds rather than promises, and she knew better than to imagine herself anywhere near his path. Yet even so she felt a subtle awareness tug at her attention, not fear and not hope, simply the sense that the moment was stretching, waiting. Across the chamber, Ethan Blackwood listened to reports he did not need and watched gestures he had memorized, nodding when expected, standing when tradition required, his posture perfect and practiced, but his focus kept drifting back to the far side of the hall where a presence lingered without insistence, and it unsettled him because it asked nothing. He had been trained to respond to challenge and spectacle, to ambition and display, yet this was different, a quiet steadiness that neither competed nor withdrew, and it slowed his thoughts in a way that felt unfamiliar and necessary. Clara noticed the shift before she understood it, a slight change in the air, the way conversations softened by degrees, the way the space between heartbeats seemed to widen, and when she looked up she did not seek him. She simply found him there, his gaze steady, not demanding, not distant, and she held it for a second longer than politeness advised before lowering her eyes again, her pulse even, her expression composed. She did not know why that moment mattered, only that it did, that something inside her settled instead of tightening, and she reminded herself that ceremonies passed whether one watched or not. A soft signal moved through the attendants like a ripple, indicating that the final preparations were nearly complete, and Clara felt the familiar urge to step back, to become smaller, yet she remained where she was, feet planted, shoulders relaxed, because leaving would draw attention and staying would not, and that logic had guided her safely for years. Ethan felt a breath leave him as he turned away from the dais, the decision to move unannounced and immediate, not announced by command but carried by instinct. And as he crossed the hall, the measured pace of his steps felt louder to him than to anyone else, each one an acknowledgement that he was choosing motion over expectation. He stopped several feet from Clara, far enough to respect custom, close enough to feel the warmth of another presence, and she sensed him before she looked, lifting her gaze to meet his without flinching, without anticipation, simply present. For a heartbeat, neither spoke, and the hall seemed to hold that silence gently, as if recognizing it belonged to them alone. And in that quiet, Ethan understood that the ceremony had already begun, not with bells or vows, but with the simple truth of being seen. The attendants hesitated when they saw the Alpha King pause beside an Omega who had no banner and no escort, their training urging them to intervene, while their instincts warned them not to. And in that fragile pause, Clara felt the familiar pull of expectation tighten around her ribs, yet she did not step back, did not apologize for occupying the space she stood in, because something in Ethan Blackwood's stillness suggested that retreat would be a mistake. He spoke quietly, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond them, asking her name as if it mattered, not as if it were a formality, and when she answered him plainly, without adornment or tremor, he nodded once, committing the sound of it to memory. Clara sensed eyes shifting toward them, curiosity stirring like a breeze across still water, but the weight of his attention anchored her, steady and unhurried, and she realized that for the first time since entering the citadel, she was not measuring herself against the room. Ethan gestured subtly toward the side corridor, a passage lit by softened torchlight that led away from the central hall, without drama, and he waited, not commanding, allowing her the choice to follow or remain, and she surprised herself by moving forward without hesitation, her steps matching his measured pace as they left the murmurs behind. The corridor narrowed and the sounds of the hall faded into a distant murmur, replaced by the quiet echo of footsteps and the faint scent of stone warmed by flame, and Clara became acutely aware of the space between them, respectful and intentional, a distance that felt like consideration rather than restraint. Ethan slowed near a small alcove where light pooled gently against carved walls, a place clearly meant for reflection rather than display, and he stopped there, turning to face her fully, his expression composed yet searching, as though he were listening for something beneath the surface of his own thoughts. He spoke again, acknowledging the ceremony waiting beyond the doors, the expectations layered upon him like armor, and he admitted without ornament that the moment demanded clarity, not performance, and Clara listened without interrupting, sensing that he did not often offer such honesty without defense. She answered carefully, not with ambition or assurance, but with truth shaped by years of observation, telling him that silence can be a form of strength, that presence does not require permission, and that sometimes what endures is not what announces itself first. Her words were simple, spoken without flourish, yet Ethan felt them settle into place with surprising weight, easing something tight in his chest that he had not known how to release. Outside the alcove, a distant bell sounded once, a reminder rather than a summons, and time pressed closer, yet neither rushed to fill the quiet, allowing it to hold them as something shared. Ethan met her eyes again, seeing not submission or strategy, but steadiness unmarred by expectation, and he understood then that the choice before him was not about spectacle or tradition, but about alignment, about the rare calm that arrives when the right presence meets the right moment. He inhaled slowly, the breath deliberate, and when he spoke next there was a softness beneath the authority that surprised even him, a recognition that the path he was about to walk would be altered not by decree but by connection. And as Clara listened, unflinching and attentive, the ceremony beyond the walls seemed to recede, leaving only the truth unfolding between them, quiet, balanced, and inevitable. The bell's echo faded into the stone as Ethan remained still for a measured second, letting the sound pass through him rather than pulling him back, and Clara sensed the decision settling, not like a sudden strike, but like a final piece sliding into place. He shifted slightly, angling his body to shield the alcove from passing glances, not to hide her, but to grant the moment a margin of quiet, and his voice lowered again, careful and clear, explaining that the ceremony would proceed whether he was ready or not. Yet readiness had never been guaranteed by tradition alone. Clara listened, her attention steady, understanding that this was not a request for reassurance but an offering of honesty, and she answered with the calm she carried so naturally, saying that choices made in stillness often last longer than those made in noise, and that whatever followed should be entered with breath intact and eyes open. Ethan felt the words land with a gentleness that surprised him, easing the tight measure of time he had carried like a ledger, and he nodded once, grateful without displaying it, before glancing toward the corridor where attendants would soon come searching. He told her there would be a brief pause before the final procession, a customary interval meant for reflection, and he asked if she would remain here for that moment, not as an order but as an invitation, and Clara agreed, the answer simple and unadorned. They stood in the shared quiet, aware of each other without urgency, the warmth of the torches steady against the carved stone, and Ethan became conscious of his breathing, the way it slowed to match the space, each inhale deliberate, each exhale unforced. He spoke then of duty not as a burden but as a shape he had learned to inhabit, admitting that power often demanded performance, and that he had mastered it too well, and Clara responded that performance can be useful, but presence is what people trust when the lights dim, and she did not say it as praise or critique, only as observation. A soft footfall echoed nearby, signaling the approach of attendants, and Ethan stepped back half a pace, restoring the respectful distance between them, his posture returning to its composed authority while his gaze remained attentive and human. He told her that when the doors opened again, the room would expect certainty, and that certainty would be given, but not before he asked one more thing, something quieter than vows and less binding than law. And Clara felt the air shift with the weight of the unspoken, her pulse even, her shoulders relaxed. He hesitated, not from doubt but from care, choosing words with precision, and she met his eyes, offering no promise beyond her presence, which was enough. The attendants appeared at the corridor's end, faces carefully neutral, and Ethan acknowledged them with a nod, signaling readiness while holding the moment intact, and as they waited for the signal to return, Clara understood that the ceremony beyond the walls would mark a turning visible to all. But what had already occurred here was the true beginning, quiet and deliberate, shaped not by expectation but by mutual recognition, and as the doors began to open and lights spilled into the corridor, Ethan drew a steady breath, knowing that whatever followed would be guided by the calm they had claimed together, a calm that did not diminish power but refined it, preparing him to step forward not alone, but aligned. The doors opened fully and the corridor brightened as the great hall revealed itself again, banners lifting slightly in the warmed air and the low murmur settling into attentive quiet, and Ethan stepped forward with a composure that felt newly grounded, not rehearsed but chosen, while Clara followed a respectful distance behind, aware of eyes turning without truly seeing her yet. The procession resumed with measured rhythm, each step counted and steady, and the familiar symbols of ceremony took their places. As if nothing had shifted, yet Ethan felt the difference in his chest, a steadiness that kept his breath even as he approached the dais. Clara returned to the position assigned to her along the side, neither hidden nor displayed, and she folded her hands as she always did, grounding herself in the simple reality of being present, listening as the officiant's voice rose with practiced clarity, naming customs that had endured longer than memory. Ethan listened without distraction, his attention sharp and calm, noting how the words sounded different now, less like instruction and more like context, and he glanced once toward where Clara stood, not openly, not in challenge to the room, but with a certainty that did not require acknowledgement. The hall responded in subtle ways, a collective stillness settling as though the audience sensed alignment without understanding its source, and Clara felt it too, the quiet acceptance that followed when a moment found its balance. The officiant paused at the customary interval before the declaration, a brief silence intended for reflection, and the candles flickered softly, casting gentle light across faces turned expectant. Ethan took that pause not as permission to hesitate, but as space to act with care, and he shifted his stance, turning slightly as if to consult a final detail, his movement unhurried and precise. He spoke to an attendant in a low voice, requesting a moment customary yet rarely used, and the request passed without question, rippling through the ranks with respectful efficiency. The hall waited, curiosity restrained by decorum, and Clara sensed the change as an invitation rather than a summons, her pulse steady as an attendant approached her quietly and gestured toward the side passage once more. She followed without resistance, the path familiar now, the torchlight gentle against the stone, and Ethan met her there with the same composed presence. The ceremony paused beyond the walls like a held breath. He did not speak immediately, allowing the quiet to settle, and Clara appreciated the patience in that choice, the way it honored the moment rather than rushing it. Ethan acknowledged the weight of what waited outside, the permanence of words soon to be spoken, and he admitted that before stepping fully into that future, he wanted one last moment of clarity unobserved, a moment to ensure that what guided him was not expectation but truth. Clara met his gaze, with calm assurance, offering no persuasion, only presence, and she told him that clarity often arrives when one allows themselves to feel what is already there. The distant murmur softened as the hall remained in suspension, and Ethan felt the alignment return, steady and sure, and he realized that the power he carried did not diminish in quiet moments, but refined itself, becoming something people could trust. He drew a measured breath, grounding himself, and in that pause the world narrowed to the simple reality of two people standing with intention, the ceremony waiting patiently for a choice shaped not by spectacle, but by sincerity. And as Ethan prepared to speak again, he knew that whatever followed would be entered with steadiness intact, guided by the calm they had already claimed. The quiet between them deepened, not heavy but attentive, as Ethan held Clara's gaze with a care that felt deliberate, and the awareness of the waiting hall settled like a distant shoreline rather than a pressure at his back, and he understood that this pause was the hinge on which everything turned. He spoke softly, not to fill the silence but to honor it, acknowledging that what he carried into the ceremony would shape not only the words he spoke, but the way he stood afterward, and he admitted that certainty forged in isolation had never felt complete, that leadership without resonance was efficient but incomplete. Clara listened without interruption, her posture relaxed, her breathing even, and she recognized the truth in his tone, the way it did not seek agreement but clarity, and she responded with a steadiness that did not promise outcomes, only presence, telling him that alignment often reveals itself when one allows the smallest honest impulse to be heard. Ethan considered that, feeling the truth of it settle, and he took a step closer, not crossing into her space but narrowing the distance enough that the warmth of shared air became noticeable, the torchlight gentle against the carved stone, and he lowered his voice further, ensuring that the words belonged to them alone. He told her that before returning to the hall, before the vows and declarations shaped the future in public, he wanted a single moment unmarked by ritual, a moment that affirmed intention rather than performance, and he asked it not as a demand, but as a request grounded in respect. Clara met his eyes, searching for expectation and finding none, only a careful openness, and she felt no rush of fear or obligation, only the calm recognition that this request honored choice. She agreed with a nod that was small and sincere, and Ethan's shoulders eased almost imperceptibly, gratitude present without display. He leaned in slightly, pausing to ensure comfort and consent were understood, and the space held, patient and clear, and when their faces drew close it was with an attentiveness that valued breath and balance over urgency. The contact that followed was brief and gentle, a simple meeting that carried no claim beyond acknowledgement. And it was the quiet certainty of it that changed him, the way his breath caught and then steadied, the way his thoughts aligned rather than scattered. Clara felt it too, not as a surge but as a settling, a confirmation that presence could be powerful without being loud, and she remained still as he drew back, the respect between them intact. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, and he smiled faintly, not for effect but from relief, recognizing that the moment had given him what he needed, not permission but clarity. Outside the alcove, the distant murmur of the hall returned, the ceremony ready to resume, and Ethan straightened, his posture composed yet changed, the authority he carried now shaped by gentleness rather than force. He thanked her quietly, acknowledging the trust implicit in the moment, and Clara accepted the thanks with calm grace, neither minimizing nor elevating what had passed, simply allowing it to be true. As they prepared to return, the world beyond the walls seemed ready to receive the decision already formed, and Ethan knew that when he stepped forward again, the words he spoke would carry the steadiness of this moment, a steadiness born not of spectacle but of alignment. And as Clara moved with him toward the light, she understood that sometimes destiny announces itself not with grandeur, but with a single, careful breath, shared before everything else begins. They stepped back into the great hall together, not side by side but aligned in a way that did not require proximity to be felt, and the room responded before any word was spoken, a subtle shift moving through the gathered ranks as attention sharpened and the quiet deepened. Ethan returned to the dais with composed authority, the kind shaped by certainty rather than force, and Clara resumed her place among the attendees, her posture unchanged yet her presence no longer unnoticed, as if the space itself had learned her name. The officiant lifted their hands to resume the ceremony, voice measured and steady, and the familiar phrases flowed again, yet they now seemed to circle a center already formed. Ethan listened, breathing evenly, his focus clear, and when the moment arrived for the declaration, the pause felt natural rather than imposed, the candles holding their light, as if waiting. He turned then, not to the expected line of candidates or toward any display of status, but toward Clara, his movement unhurried and precise, and the room followed the line of his attention in a wave of quiet realization. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying without effort, naming choice not as spectacle but as truth, and he acknowledged the Omega who stood without ornament and without fear, stating his intention with calm certainty rather than flourish. The hall fell into complete stillness, surprise contained by decorum, and Clara felt the weight of attention settle without pressure, her breath steady as she met his gaze again, recognizing not triumph but alignment. Ethan extended his hand, the gesture simple and open, and waited, allowing the moment to belong to her as much as to him. And Clara stepped forward with quiet confidence, placing her hand in his without haste, the contact grounding and sure. A collective breath moved through the hall, the kind that follows recognition rather than shock, and the officiant resumed with composure, adapting tradition to the choice made, the words reshaping themselves around a truth already present. Ethan stood tall, his authority undiminished and refined, and Clara remained composed at his side, neither elevated nor diminished by the attention, simply present. The ceremony continued, vows spoken with clarity and care, and as the final words settled, the hall responded with respectful acknowledgement, the sound restrained yet sincere. Clara sensed the shift around her, the way eyes now held curiosity rather than dismissal, and she remained steady, understanding that recognition did not require performance. Ethan glanced toward her once more, the look brief and private, a confirmation that what had guided him here remained intact, and she returned it with calm assurance. As the officiant concluded, declaring the ceremony complete, the bells rang softly, not to announce spectacle but to mark transition, and the sound filled the hall with measured resonance. Ethan turned to address the gathered assembly, speaking of unity and intention, of leadership shaped by presence and trust, and his words carried a weight that felt earned rather than imposed. When he finished, he returned his attention to Clara, offering his arm not as command but as invitation, and she accepted with the same quiet certainty that had brought her this far. Together they stood beneath the banners, not defined by contrast but by balance, and the hall seemed to settle around them, recognizing that something enduring had taken shape, not through force or display, but through the simple courage to choose alignment when the moment asked for it. The hall did not erupt into chaos or celebration, but into something steadier and more enduring, a respectful hum of acknowledgement that felt earned rather than performed, and Clara sensed the change immediately. The way the air no longer pressed against her, but opened, allowing her to breathe without calculation. Ethan guided her a step forward, not to display her, but to stand with her, and the distinction mattered, because the attention that followed was not sharp or consuming, but curious and recalibrating, as if the room itself was learning a new shape. The banners above shifted gently as a current of warm air moved through the chamber, and Clara felt grounded by the simple contact of his arm beneath her hand, a reminder that presence did not require explanation. Ethan addressed the assembly once more, his voice carrying calm assurance, speaking of continuity and care, of leadership shaped by listening as much as decision, and the words landed with a resonance that quieted even the most restless observers. Clara listened, not to assess or measure, but to understand the rhythm of what he was offering, recognizing the way his tone invited trust rather than demanded allegiance. When he finished, the officiant nodded with composed approval, signaling the formal close, and attendants moved with practiced ease to transition the hall from ceremony to reception, the shift seamless and unhurried. Clara felt eyes still following her, but the quality had changed, curiosity replacing dismissal, and she met it with the same calm she had carried all evening, understanding that recognition would take time to settle. Ethan turned slightly toward her, his expression composed yet warm, and he spoke quietly, thanking her. Not for compliance, but for steadiness, for meeting the moment without distortion, and she accepted the words with a small nod, acknowledging the truth of them without embellishment. They moved together through the hall, the path clear without being forced, and Clara noticed how people stepped aside not out of fear but respect, adjusting to a reality that had quietly taken hold. The reception space opened beyond the arches, softened by warmer light and the subtle scent of cedar and citrus, and the murmur of conversation resumed at a comfortable volume, the energy relaxed yet attentive. Ethan paused near the threshold, allowing Clara to take in the space, not guiding her forward until she was ready, and she appreciated the care in that restraint, the way it preserved her agency. She spoke then, her voice calm and even, telling him that the hall felt different now, not because of the ceremony, but because of the intention carried into it, and Ethan agreed, recognizing the truth of it with a quiet smile. They stood for a moment apart from the flow, the world adjusting around them, and Clara felt a sense of alignment settle fully, not dramatic or overwhelming, but clear and sustainable. Ethan offered her a choice of where to begin, not as a test, but as an invitation, and she indicated a small table near the windows where the moonlight filtered in softly, preferring steadiness over spectacle. As they moved there together, the night beyond the glass seemed to mirror the calm inside, the moon steady in its arc, and Clara understood that what had unfolded was not an ending, but a beginning shaped by intention rather than force. She did not feel transformed into something new, but recognized more clearly what she had always been. And as Ethan took his place beside her, the future no longer felt like a performance waiting to happen, but a path already underfoot, quiet, balanced, and open. As the evening settled into its quieter rhythm, the reception unfolding with unforced grace, Clara found herself standing beside the tall windows, watching the moon trace its slow path across the sky, and she felt no urge to measure the moment against expectation, only to be present within it. Ethan joined her there without ceremony, the space between them easy and unguarded, and for a time they stood in companionable silence, listening to the soft cadence of conversation and the distant notes of music that seemed to respect the calm rather than challenge it. He spoke then, not as a ruler addressing a crowd, but as a man acknowledging a turning, telling her that strength had always been defined to him as endurance and command, yet tonight had reframed it as something quieter and more precise, the ability to listen without losing direction. Clara considered his words and replied with the same thoughtful steadiness that had guided her all evening, saying that gentleness does not erase resolve, it refines it, and that what lasts is often built without spectacle. Ethan nodded, recognizing the truth of it, and he felt a rare sense of ease settle fully, the kind that does not dull awareness but sharpens it with clarity. Around them, The gathering continued to adjust, conversations weaving naturally, glances softening, and Clara sensed that her place within this world was no longer defined by invisibility, but by balance, a position earned not by display, but by presence. She did not feel elevated above herself, only more fully aligned with who she had always been, and that realization carried a quiet confidence that required no reinforcement. Ethan glanced toward the hall, and then back to her, noting how naturally she held the space, and he understood that leadership shaped in this way would ripple outward, influencing tone and trust long after the evening ended. He offered her a small smile, one that carried gratitude rather than triumph, and she returned it with calm assurance, accepting the shared understanding without ceremony. The moonlight brightened briefly as clouds shifted, casting silver across the floor, and Clara felt the symbolism without needing to claim it, recognizing that moments do not need to be named to matter. Ethan spoke again, quietly, acknowledging that the path ahead would carry complexity and challenge, but that he entered it now with steadiness intact, guided by the alignment they had found, and Clara responded that paths walked with intention often reveal their direction step by step, and that trust begins with the willingness to remain present. They stood together as the evening drew toward its close, neither rushed nor held back, and the world beyond the windows seemed expansive rather than daunting. As the final notes of music softened and the gathering began to disperse with respectful ease, Ethan offered his arm once more, not as a symbol, but as a simple gesture of continuity, and Clara accepted, her posture relaxed, her expression serene. Together they moved toward the exit, the hall parting with quiet acknowledgement, and as they stepped into the cooler night air, the stars steady overhead, Ethan reflected that true strength had revealed itself not through force or declaration, but through a moment of gentleness that clarified everything, and Clara felt the truth of it settle within her, knowing that love, when it arrives with respect and balance, does not overwhelm or demand. It simply opens the way forward, clear and enduring, inviting both to walk on with breath intact and purpose aligned.